The moment the cameras turned, he thought the story belonged to him. The ballroom of the Westbridge Awards Gala glittered under crystal chandeliers, every flash of light capturing a carefully constructed illusion of success. Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it all, one arm wrapped possessively around Brianna Cole, his newest image of perfection, his voice low as he leaned toward her like the world had already signed off on his victory. Every journalist, every investor, every guest watched him as if he were untouchable. He smiled for them, performed for them, and then, without hesitation, made sure the world saw exactly what he wanted it to see. Some chapters are meant to be closed, he said into the nearest microphone with a calm, rehearsed certainty, glancing briefly toward the shadows where he knew Alicia Carter's absence would be noticed. Laughter followed, soft and approving, the kind that comes when people believe they are watching a winner define the past. Brianna tilted her head against his shoulder, playing her part perfectly, a curated image of replacement and reward. But at the edge of the ballroom feed, somewhere far from the stage lights, Alicia Carter watched everything unfold through a live stream on a small screen, the glow reflecting in her still expression. Once, she had been the one signing documents beside Daniel, the one reviewing contracts at midnight, the one quietly building the structure beneath his success. Now her name wasn't spoken, as if it had been erased cleanly enough to never have mattered. She didn't react when the camera zoomed in on Brianna's smile or when Daniel raised a glass to his new beginning. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table in front of her, steady, composed, unreadable. Outside the frame of that gala, the city continued moving, cars passing through Manhattan streets, people walking under neon signs, but inside that moment, a line had already been crossed that no one on that stage understood yet. Alicia slowly lowered the phone, the silence in her surroundings heavier than any applause echoing from the ballroom feed. There was no anger in her face, no visible fracture, only a quiet stillness. That suggested something had already shifted far beyond what the camera could capture. And somewhere beneath that silence, a decision had already been made that no one in that glittering room was prepared to see coming. The city did not pause for her silence. Hours after the gala lights burned into memory, Alicia Carter stood alone in a quiet apartment overlooking the skyline, where the distant glow of Manhattan felt colder than usual. The live stream had ended, but the images remained, looping in her mind not as pain, but as something distant, almost detached, like watching a story that no longer belonged to her. Daniel Whitmore's voice still echoed faintly in the back of her thoughts, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something she had already accepted long before that night. She had been rewritten out of a narrative she once helped build. On a wooden desk near the window, a plain black folder sat untouched, its edges sharp, its presence deliberate. Inside were documents she had not opened in months, contracts, signatures, records of decisions that once defined her days and nights. She did not reach for them yet. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window, watching traffic flow like veins of light beneath the city's pulse. Somewhere in that movement, life continued without permission, without apology. A soft notification blinked on a second device across the room, a private line that only a few people could access. The name on the screen read Ethan Caldwell. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood still, as if measuring the weight of the silence she was about to break. When she finally picked up the phone, her voice remained steady, controlled, almost calm in a way that did not match the storm everyone assumed she carried. Ethan did not ask questions about what she had seen. He never did. That was the difference between curiosity and understanding. "Are you still attending the Caldwell Foundation meeting next week?" he asked, his tone measured, business-like, grounded. Alicia looked back at the skyline, her reflection faint in the glass, layered over the city like a second version of herself. "Yes," she replied simply. No hesitation. No explanation. On the other end, there was a brief pause, then a quiet acknowledgement as if the answer had always been expected. After the call ended, she placed the phone down again, not rushing, not reacting. The black folder remained closed, but its presence now felt different, less like a reminder of the past and more like something waiting to be activated. Far away, in a world of chandeliers and applause that still replayed on social feeds, Daniel Whitmore continued his version of the story, unaware that the narrative he believed he owned had already begun to shift in places he could not see. Alicia turned away from the window and finally opened the folder, not with hesitation, but with certainty, as if crossing a line no one else had noticed yet, and in that quiet moment, the next chapter had already begun. The black folder finally opened under the soft light of the apartment, revealing a world Alicia Carter had once kept sealed behind careful trust and long nights of work that no one ever credited publicly. Inside were records that told a different version of the past, not the one spoken about in gala halls or business magazines, but the one written in signatures, equity splits, private communications, and decisions that had quietly built Daniel Whitmore's rise from an unknown operator into a recognized name. Alicia did not read them with emotion. She read them like data. Each page confirmed what she already understood: her contributions had not disappeared, they had been reassigned, reframed, and in some cases deliberately omitted. Still, there was no anger on her face, only focus, as if she was organizing pieces of a puzzle that others had forgotten they left behind. When she reached the final section of the folder, her eyes paused briefly on a clause referencing intellectual property holdings tied to a subsidiary company under the Whitmore brand, a structure she had personally reviewed years ago but never revisited after the separation. She closed the folder halfway, not out of hesitation, but out of timing, as if saving the next move for when it mattered most. Across the city, morning light began to replace the memory of the gala night, and Daniel Whitmore arrived at his office in Midtown Manhattan with the confidence of a man who believed yesterday had ended exactly as intended. His assistant briefed him on media traction, sponsorship interest, and growing attention around his public appearance. Every detail reinforced his sense of control. In his mind, the narrative had already stabilized, he had moved forward, and the past had been left behind. Brianna Cole accompanied him into the building, her presence curated for visibility, each step designed for perception rather than substance. Yet behind the polished surface of their schedule, small disruptions had already begun to appear in quiet corners of the system. Emails flagged for review remained unanswered longer than usual. A scheduled board confirmation meeting had been shifted without clear explanation. A legal department memo referencing historical equity clarification circulated among senior staff without reaching Daniel directly. None of it seemed urgent on its own, but together it formed a pattern too subtle for arrogance to detect. That same morning, Alicia left her apartment dressed in simple, structured attire, carrying no visible indication of what she now held privately. She walked through the city with steady pace, blending into the rhythm of professionals moving between meetings and decisions that shaped industries. When she arrived at a private office building in downtown Manhattan, she did not announce herself. She did not need to. The reception desk already had instructions waiting under a reserved name. The elevator ride upward was silent, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but intentional. On the top floor, a conference room overlooked the city skyline, where glass and steel reflected both ambition and consequence. Inside, Ethan Caldwell was already present, reviewing documents with calm precision. He looked up as Alicia entered, and there was no surprise in his expression, only acknowledgement, as if the timing had been expected from the beginning. He gestured toward the seat across from him, and she sat without hesitation, placing the black folder on the table between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan asked a simple question about readiness, not in terms of emotion, but execution. Alicia's response was equally simple, confirming alignment without elaboration. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its relentless motion, unaware that certain structures beneath its surface were no longer as stable as they appeared. And in a high-rise office miles away, Daniel Whitmore reviewed his calendar for the week ahead, still believing that everything important had already been decided, while in another part of the same city, decisions were being finalized that would redefine what he thought he controlled. The morning in Manhattan carried a different kind of tension, the kind that does not announce itself with noise but with precision, like a system quietly shifting its own gravity. Inside the Caldwell Group headquarters, Alicia Carter remained seated in the top-floor conference room, the city stretched beneath her like a moving map of decisions already in motion. The black folder now lay open between her and Ethan Caldwell, its contents no longer treated as history but as structure, each page reviewed not for memory but for consequence. Ethan's eyes moved across the documents with calm focus, his expression unchanged, as if he had already anticipated every layer hidden within them. Alicia spoke rarely, only when clarity was required, her voice steady and measured, outlining connections between old agreements, dormant clauses, and equity distributions that had been quietly reshaped over time. There was no emotion in her delivery, only precision, as if she were describing a machine she once helped design and now understood better in its full form. Ethan listened without interruption, occasionally marking notes on a digital screen, then pausing briefly at a section that referenced legacy ownership rights tied to a subsidiary under the Whitmore corporate structure. He did not react outwardly, but the silence that followed carried weight, the kind of silence that signals recognition of a system that can be activated rather than explained. At that moment, the conversation shifted from review to alignment. Not a confrontation, not a reaction, but an agreement forming. Quietly between two people who understood timing as a form of control. Across town, Daniel Whitmore began his day inside a glass office overlooking Midtown, reviewing performance summaries and investor updates that reinforced his belief in stability. His calendar remained full, his meetings confirmed, his public image still intact. He spoke briefly with his executive team about expansion strategies and media presence, his tone confident, almost detached from uncertainty. Brianna Cole accompanied him later that morning to a brand presentation, where cameras once again captured curated moments of success. Yet beneath the surface of polished schedules and controlled appearances, subtle changes were already beginning to spread through internal channels. A compliance team requested clarification on older partnership structures. A legal review board flagged inconsistencies in archived documentation. A senior advisor paused mid-meeting after receiving a quiet notification that redirected attention toward previously closed accounts. None of these signals were dramatic on their own, but together they created a pattern that no longer aligned with the narrative Daniel believed was fixed. Back at Caldwell Group, Alicia finally closed the folder, not because it was finished, but because it had reached the point of transition. Ethan leaned back slightly, acknowledging without words that the preparation phase was complete. He asked a simple question about timing, not what would happen, but when it would begin. Alicia turned toward the city beyond the glass, watching sunlight reflect off steel towers that moved like a living system unaware of its own recalibration. Her response was calm, direct, and final in its intent. There was no urgency in her tone, only certainty shaped by patience. As she stood to leave the room, the folder remained on the table, no longer a collection of records but a trigger point waiting for activation. Down below, Manhattan continued its rhythm of meetings, deals, and assumptions of control, while in offices scattered across the city, quiet instructions began to circulate through channels that rarely drew attention until it was too late. And in the center of that unfolding shift, Daniel Whitmore remained focused on the version of reality he had already declared complete, unaware that the structure supporting it was no longer as stable as he believed. The morning had fully settled into Manhattan, but inside the upper floors of Caldwell Group, time felt compressed into something sharper, almost like pressure building behind glass. Alicia Carter stood once again in the conference room, though now the atmosphere had changed from preparation to execution. The black folder was no longer open. It was closed, placed neatly at the center of the table like an object that had already fulfilled its purpose. Ethan Caldwell stood by the window, reviewing updates on a private display, his expression steady but attentive in a way that suggested multiple systems were now moving in parallel. Alicia did not speak immediately. Instead, she observed the city below, the constant movement of traffic and people forming a rhythm that felt indifferent to the changes already unfolding behind closed doors. When she finally turned back toward Ethan, her voice carried the same calm precision as before, but now it held a quiet certainty that the foundation stage had ended. Ethan acknowledged with a slight nod, then referenced a sequence of internal confirmations that had just been completed across several departments, each one subtle enough on its own but together forming a coordinated shift in authority lines. There was no celebration in the room, no visible satisfaction, only alignment. Meanwhile, across the city in Midtown Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore stepped into a boardroom filled with senior executives, unaware that the tone of the room would not match his expectations. He began the meeting as he always did, with structured confidence, referencing growth metrics, media engagement, and upcoming expansion strategies. Brianna Cole sat beside him, maintaining the composed presence that had become part of his public narrative. However, as the meeting progressed, subtle interruptions began to surface. A senior legal advisor requested clarification on a historical equity structure tied to a previously inactive subsidiary. Another executive mentioned a pending review initiated not by external pressure, but from within the organization's own compliance framework. Daniel paused briefly, his expression tightening slightly as he attempted to re-establish control over the direction of the conversation. Yet the responses he received were no longer purely supportive. They were procedural, careful, and unusually neutral. In another part of the city, Alicia entered a private review room within the Caldwell facility where a live corporate dashboard displayed cascading updates across multiple systems linked to Whitmore Holdings. Ethan stood beside her, noting that certain dormant clauses had now been triggered by routine verification processes, not by direct confrontation. Alicia observed the screen without emotion, her focus remaining on the structural flow rather than individual outcomes. The mechanism she had helped design years earlier was not aggressive in appearance. It was administrative, procedural, and designed to activate only when specific conditions were met. That was why it had remained invisible for so long. Back in the boardroom, Daniel received a notification on his tablet that caused him to pause mid-sentence. The message referenced a temporary restriction on authorization pending review of legacy documentation. His eyes scanned the room briefly, searching for immediate explanation, but the expressions around him remained professionally neutral. Brianna leaned slightly toward him, sensing a shift she could not fully identify. The atmosphere had changed, not through confrontation, but through absence of confirmation. Alicia, still in the Caldwell facility, finally stepped away from the screen and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city. Ethan followed at a measured distance, then spoke quietly about timing for the next phase of disclosure. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched the skyline where sunlight reflected off towers that continued operating as if nothing beneath them had altered. When she finally spoke, her words were simple and deliberate, confirming that the system was now beyond the point of reversal. There was no need for urgency, only continuation. And thus, Manhattan carried on with its meetings, transactions, and carefully constructed narratives. The underlying structure that supported one man's certainty had already begun to respond to a different source of authority, one that had remained silent until the exact moment silence itself became the strongest form of action. The afternoon light in Manhattan had shifted into a quieter tone, as if the city itself was holding its breath without understanding why. Seated the Caldwell Group Tower, Alicia Carter remained in the same elevated conference space, but the energy around her had changed again, becoming more defined, more irreversible. The black folder now sat close beside a thin stack of confirmation reports, each one marked with timestamps that reflected coordinated activity across multiple corporate layers. Ethan Caldwell stood near the glass wall, his attention fixed on a live internal feed displaying structured updates moving through systems tied to Whitmore Corporate Holdings. There was no rush in his posture, only precision, the calm awareness of someone watching a process reach maturity. Alicia did not speak at first. She reviewed a final set of confirmations on a tablet, her eyes moving steadily across structured data that represented not just information, but transitions in authority that had been quietly executed through predefined conditions. Each update reflected a shift that required no confrontation, only verification. When she finally set the device down, her voice carried the same controlled clarity she had maintained from the beginning, confirming that all preparatory phases had reached completion. Ethan acknowledged with a slight movement of his head, then mentioned that internal compliance triggers had already initiated secondary reviews within several departments tied to Whitmore Enterprises. The system was now operating without direct input, following procedural logic established long before any visible change had occurred. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore entered another scheduled engagement, this time a private investor briefing held in a high-rise conference center overlooking Central Park. The room was filled with familiar faces. Individuals who had previously reinforced his confidence through consistent approval. He began speaking with his usual structured confidence, outlining projections and strategic initiatives, expecting alignment without interruption. However, the atmosphere in the room did not respond as it once did. Questions emerged that were not challenging in tone but procedural in nature, referencing updated compliance requirements that had not been part of earlier discussions. Daniel paused briefly, adjusting his approach, attempting to maintain continuity in his presentation. Yet the interruptions continued, each one subtle but increasingly aligned in direction, as if the framework supporting his narrative had begun to shift independently of his control. Brianna Cole observed quietly, her attention moving between the speakers and Daniel, sensing a change that was not visible but clearly present in the responses around them. At Caldwell Group, Alicia walked slowly along the length of the glass wall, watching the city transition into its afternoon rhythm. Ethan joined her side, briefly noting that one of the subsidiary review boards had requested full documentation on legacy equity structures within the Whitmore portfolio. Alicia listened without reaction, her expression unchanged, as if each development was simply a continuation of a sequence already accounted for. There was no surprise in her demeanor, only confirmation that the process was unfolding exactly as designed. Ethan then mentioned that external advisory channels had begun to seek clarification regarding ownership continuity, a signal that attention was now expanding beyond internal systems. Alicia finally responded, stating only that visibility was expected at this stage, and that awareness always followed structure once activation thresholds were crossed. In the investor briefing, Daniel's presentation slowed as he reviewed updated materials projected onto the screen. Certain figures no longer aligned with previous records he had approved. He attempted to address the discrepancies, but responses from the compliance representative redirected the conversation toward documentation integrity rather than forward. Strategy. The shift was subtle but undeniable. What had once been a controlled environment of affirmation was now becoming a structured review space where assumptions required verification. Back in the Caldwell Tower, Alicia returned to the table and placed her hand lightly on the closed folder, not as an action of urgency, but as a marker of completion for the stage that had led them here. Ethan observed quietly, then confirmed that the next phase would involve broader disclosure channels, extending beyond internal systems into public financial oversight frameworks. Alicia did not respond immediately. She looked out across the skyline one more time, where the city continued its constant motion without awareness of the structural adjustments taking place within it. When she finally spoke, her words were calm and definitive, acknowledging that the transition had already moved past the point of reversal. And in that moment, across multiple floors of glass and steel, systems once aligned under a single narrative continued to shift toward a new configuration that no longer centered on the certainty Daniel Whitmore believed he still controlled. The evening in Manhattan arrived with a slower pulse, but inside the financial district the systems that governed movement, approval, and authority were already operating under a different rhythm. At Caldwell Group, Alicia Carter stood once again before the panoramic glass wall, the city below glowing in layered shades of gold and steel as daylight faded into artificial light. The black folder remained closed on the table behind her, no longer treated as an object of review but as a finalized point of origin for everything now unfolding. Ethan Caldwell stood nearby, quietly monitoring a sequence of live structural updates moving through multiple corporate frameworks tied to Whitmore Enterprises. There was no urgency in his posture, only confirmation as each layer of information completed its transition from dormant state to active review channels. Alicia's attention remained fixed outward, her expression composed, as she absorbed the awareness that visibility had now expanded beyond internal systems. Reports were beginning to surface through external advisory networks, quietly referencing discrepancies in legacy equity alignment and historical authorization structures. These were not accusations, nor confrontations, but procedural signals that the architecture supporting past decisions was now being examined under updated conditions. Ethan broke the silence briefly, noting that several independent financial reviewers had initiated parallel assessments without direct coordination, a sign that the system had entered a phase of self-reinforcement. Alicia responded without turning away from the city, her voice steady and precise, acknowledging that once structural integrity is questioned at one layer, it naturally propagates through all connected systems. Meanwhile, across Midtown Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore attended a private executive dinner hosted by key stakeholders who had long supported his expansion strategies. The atmosphere was refined, filled with measured conversation and controlled confidence, yet beneath the surface there was a subtle shift in tone that Daniel could not immediately identify. Conversations that once flowed with alignment now carried pauses slightly longer than usual. Questions were still polite, but they were increasingly specific, referencing documentation and verification processes rather than forward projections. Daniel maintained composure, responding with structured clarity, reinforcing confidence in existing frameworks. Brianna Cole sat beside him, observing the room carefully, sensing a change in energy that was not openly acknowledged but clearly present in the rhythm of dialogue. At one point, a senior partner mentioned a scheduled audit review tied to long-standing subsidiary agreements, noting that external compliance advisors had been engaged earlier than expected. The statement was casual in tone, but it altered the atmosphere in the room in a way that no one openly addressed. Back at Caldwell Group, Alicia moved from the glass wall to the central table, placing her hand lightly near the closed folder as Ethan projected a live network map of interconnected corporate entities across the city. Lines of influence, ownership, and authorization were gradually shifting in color as updates propagated through verified channels. Alicia studied the pattern in silence, recognizing not disruption but completion of a sequence designed long in advance. Ethan confirmed that public regulatory frameworks would begin reflecting updated records within a controlled timeframe, ensuring that visibility expanded in measured stages rather than sudden exposure. Alicia acknowledged this calmly, emphasizing that timing preserved stability even during structural change. In the executive dinner, Daniel briefly checked a notification on his device, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before returning to controlled neutrality. The message referenced a temporary hold on certain authorization pathways pending verification of historical alignment. It was framed as routine, procedural, and non-urgent, yet its presence interrupted the flow of his certainty. He set the device down and continued the conversation, but his attention no longer rested fully on the room. Instead, it began shifting towards something unspoken, a growing awareness that the environment around him was no longer responding with the consistency he had always relied upon. As night settled over Manhattan, Alicia remained still for a moment longer, watching the city's lights form a network of movement and intent far below. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only recognition that systems built on assumption always reveal themselves when structure is redefined. Ethan stepped slightly closer, noting that the next phase would involve public alignment of records with verified ownership structures, extending beyond corporate boundaries into broader financial visibility. Alicia finally turned away from the glass, her decision already made without hesitation. And in that quiet transition, while one man continued to believe he was navigating a stable world of predictable outcomes, the foundation beneath that certainty continued to adjust itself toward a new order that had already begun to replace what came before. The morning after the shift in corporate alignment arrived with an unfamiliar quietness across Manhattan, as if the city was processing changes it could not yet fully interpret. Inside Caldwell Group, Alicia Carter stood once again at the glass wall overlooking the financial district, her presence steady and composed, while the city below continued its uninterrupted rhythm of movement and ambition. The black folder remained on the central table, now untouched, no longer a tool of preparation but a completed mechanism whose effects were already propagating beyond the room. Ethan Caldwell stood nearby, reviewing live confirmations flowing through regulatory and financial channels that now reflected updated structures tied to Whitmore Enterprises. Each update appeared incremental on its own, yet together they formed a consistent redirection of authority that no longer depended on interpretation, only recognition. Alicia listened as Ethan outlined the latest confirmations from external compliance systems, noting that multiple independent review bodies had now synchronized their data sets with the revised ownership framework. There was no sense of urgency in his tone, only acknowledgement that the process had entered its final visible stage. Alicia responded with calm precision, stating that once external validation aligns across independent systems, perception follows structure without resistance. Across Midtown Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore entered his office earlier than usual, his schedule already populated with meetings that were now being subtly redefined by external review requirements. At first glance, everything appeared normal. His assistant delivered standard briefings, investor relations updates, and media coordination notes. However, beneath these routine interactions, a growing number of agenda items had been adjusted, reclassified, or marked for additional verification. Daniel noticed the changes but initially dismissed them as procedural refinements, continuing to focus on forward-facing strategy discussions. In a high-level executive briefing that morning, he presented updated forecasts and expansion models, expecting the familiar alignment that had always reinforced his position. Instead, he was met with carefully structured questions regarding legacy asset validation and historical equity continuity. The tone of the room remained professional, but the direction of inquiry had clearly shifted. Brianna Cole observed the exchange closely, her composure unchanged, though her awareness of the room's energy was becoming increasingly acute. Daniel attempted to steer the discussion back toward growth initiatives, but each response from the compliance advisors redirected attention toward documentation that had not previously been questioned in such detail. Meanwhile, at Caldwell Group, Alicia reviewed a final synchronization report indicating that public financial databases were beginning to reflect the updated ownership structure in controlled phases. Ethan noted that external media analytics had also begun detecting anomalies in previously stable narratives surrounding Whitmore Enterprises, with early discussions emerging across financial forums and advisory networks. Alicia did not react to the mention of public visibility. Instead, she focused on the principle that systems, once corrected at structural level, naturally propagate consistency outward through all dependent layers. There was no need to accelerate the process, only to allow it to complete its own logic. In the Whitmore office, Daniel received a notification that caused him to pause longer than before. A scheduled investor update had been temporarily suspended pending verification of underlying corporate documentation. This was not framed as a penalty or a dispute, but as a procedural necessity. Still, it interrupted the flow of his expectations in a way that could not be easily dismissed. He set the device down and looked toward the city skyline, as if searching for clarity in a system that had always previously responded to his direction. Back at Caldwell Group, Ethan confirmed that the next stage would involve broader institutional acknowledgement, extending beyond private systems into publicly indexed financial records. Alicia turned slightly from the glass wall, acknowledging the transition without hesitation. Her expression remained composed, but the finality in her stillness suggested that the process had moved beyond initiation and into irreversible continuation. And across Manhattan, as offices continued their routines and conversations remained carefully controlled, the underlying structure supporting one man's certainty continued to adjust itself quietly into a configuration that no longer reflected the narrative he believed he still controlled. The final morning arrived over Manhattan with a stillness that felt different from everything that had come before it, as if the city itself was waiting for a result rather than an event. Inside the Caldwell Group, Alicia Carter stood at the same glass wall overlooking the financial district, but this time she was no longer observing movement in preparation or transition. She was observing completion. The black folder remained closed on the table behind her, untouched, its purpose fully realized within systems that no longer required physical reference to continue operating. Ethan Caldwell stood a few feet away, reviewing the final convergence report across multiple financial and regulatory networks tied to Whitmore Enterprises. The data flowing across the screen showed uniform alignment, as public, institutional, and internal records now reflected a consistent structure that had replaced previous fragmentation. There was no urgency in the room, only final confirmation that the sequence had reached its intended equilibrium. Alicia spoke calmly, acknowledging that once independent systems converge on the same structure without contradiction, perception no longer resists reality but adapts to it. Ethan nodded slightly, confirming that external markets and advisory channels had already begun adjusting their assessments in response to the updated frameworks. Across Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore arrived at his office with the expectation of resolution, unaware that what awaited him was not resolution but recognition. His morning began like any other, with structured briefings and scheduled updates, but the tone of the environment had shifted in a way that was no longer subtle. Meetings that once centered on expansion and forward strategy now opened with confirmation reviews and historical validation requests. Documents that had previously been accepted without question were now being Referenced against independent registries that no longer aligned with his internal records. Daniel maintained composure as he entered a high-level executive session, but the room did not respond with its usual alignment. Instead, there was a controlled formality, as if every statement required verification before acceptance. Brianna Cole sat beside him, her expression composed but increasingly aware that the structure around them was no longer reinforcing their narrative. At Caldwell Group, Alicia finally turned away from the glass wall and walked toward the center of the room. Ethan indicated that public financial platforms were now reflecting the updated ownership architecture in real time, with major institutional dashboards synchronizing within minutes of each other. There was no longer separation between internal correction and external visibility. Alicia acknowledged this without hesitation, stating that once alignment reaches public systems, interpretation becomes collective rather than individual. In Midtown Manhattan, Daniel received a notification that caused a brief silence in his movements. Public filings had been updated to reflect revised equity structures and historical authorization adjustments within Whitmore Enterprises. The language was neutral, procedural, and verified across multiple independent sources. I read it once, then again, as if repetition could restore familiarity to something that had already shifted beyond it. The room around him remained composed, but the dynamic had changed. Conversations paused longer before responding. Questions no longer accepted assumptions. Each interaction now required confirmation rather than continuation. Back at Caldwell Group, Ethan confirmed that media analytics, financial indexes, and institutional reporting systems had all completed synchronization. Alicia stood quietly for a moment, not reacting to the scale of the change, but recognizing the finality of structure fully revealed. There was no celebration, no emphasis, only completion. Across the city, Daniel stepped out of the executive meeting into a corridor that suddenly felt longer than before. The certainty he had relied on no longer extended beyond what could be verified in real time. Yet the world around him continued as if nothing had changed, because for most, the change had already been integrated without resistance. And in the quiet height of Caldwell Group, Alicia Carter remained still for a final moment, not as someone witnessing a reversal, but as someone observing a system return to its original balance after long distortion, while Manhattan moved forward unaware that what had once been hidden had already become the new structure beneath everything it believed was stable.